England takes Jamaica in 1655 and declares authority immediately. What it lacks is the capacity to enforce that authority inland. Control in a plantation colony depends on a chain of requirements: bodies to apply force, food to sustain those bodies, and protected movement to connect them across space. Jamaica breaks that chain at every point. Garrisons are thin, roads are few, and the interior is difficult to traverse. Authority is declared before it can be enforced. The island is claimed as territory, but it cannot yet be governed as one. From the start, Jamaica is a possession without depth, a coastline with only a weak hold on its interior. The problem is not intent but logistics. Without secure movement and supply, rule cannot extend far from the ports. Plantation ambition expands into a landscape that cannot yet be administered. Plantation growth outpaces administration. Sugar estates spread rapidly along the coastal plains and river valleys. Export ports become efficient long before inland security exists. Roads lag behind land grants, and bureaucracy forms after production has begun. Enslaved labor becomes the colony's principal capital asset before there is any reliable way to contain it. The system expands faster than it safeguards. This creates lasting tension. A plantation concentrates people, tools, and information in one place, but it depends on movement of food, overseers, and patrols to keep that concentration intact. Jamaica's interior prevents that movement from becoming routine. The state builds an export machine without first building a circulation system. The result is a colony that can extract value from its edges but cannot stabilize its center. Expansion produces wealth, but it also produces a population that must be held in place under conditions the colony cannot yet sustain. Flight is not an accidental byproduct of this system. It is the result of how plantations operate. Plantations do not only concentrate coercion, they also concentrate knowledge. Enslaved workers learn routes, terrain, and patterns of supervision. They acquire tools and agricultural skills that can be used elsewhere. As plantations grow, so does the possibility of leaving them. Escape routes appear because estates scale outward. Larger properties mean longer perimeters, more unobserved movement, and greater opportunity for coordination. Information moves along labor lines. The same conditions that increase output also create the means to evade control. When flight occurs, it follows geography and weakness rather than chance. The colony treats this as a policing problem, but its causes lie in how production is organized. The plantation creates both the pressure to flee and the ability to do so. Runaways form camps. Camps become settlements. Settlements become food systems. At that point, the problem changes category. It is no longer about retrieving individuals. It becomes a matter of confronting communities that can sustain themselves. Food production allows permanence. Defense allows continuity. Communication allows growth. These communities exist inside the colony, not beyond it. They draw labor out of plantations and deny it to owners. They offer an alternative place to live and an alternative position for those still enslaved. What begins as movement becomes control over land and people. The interior of Jamaica develops spaces shaped by colonial pressure but not colonial rule. These communities control food, regulate membership, and choose when to fight or withdraw. The colony now confronts organized settlements rather than individual fugitives. To planters, this is existential not because maroon communities can seize Kingston, but because they undermine discipline. The threat is not conquest. It is example. If escape can work, coercion loses certainty. Plantation control depends on the belief that there is nowhere else to go. Maroon settlements show that there is. Every successful escape weakens the credibility of punishment and raises the value of resistance. The system must respond not only to actual losses but to the risk of imitation. Repression becomes preventative as well as punitive. Maroon survival shows that the limits of force are visible. This is why campaigns are framed in absolute terms. They are not only about territory. They are about restoring the conditions under which labor can be held. The difficulty is that restoring those conditions requires projecting power into terrain where power can not be cheaply sustained. Geography becomes defensive infrastructure. Jamaica is not a single battlefield, but a set of zones with different properties. The coastal plains are open, accessible, and tied to export. The interior is fragmented and enclosed. Two regions shape Maroon strategy. The cockpit country consists of sinkholes and basins divided by narrow ridges. Visibility is short, and movement is confined to known tracks. Artillery cannot be used effectively because there is no clear line of fire. Columns must descend and climb repeatedly, losing cohesion and speed. Supply animals struggle on broken ground. Ambush favors the stationary defender. In this environment, distance is measured in exposure rather than miles. A small force that knows the routes can impose costs far greater than its size suggests. Terrain replaces walls and forts. Local knowledge becomes a defensive system. The Blue Mountains form a different but equally resistant setting. Height brings cloud, rain, and cold. Trails are narrow and often follow streams. Columns move slowly and remain wet. Fever and exposure become constant risks. Visibility is reduced by mist and vegetation. Camps cannot be easily resupplied because pack trains must use the same narrow paths as troops. Retreat can be made in several directions that pursuers cannot see. In both regions, the environment weakens the advantages of formal armies. Firepower is limited to what can be carried, and coordination becomes a liability. The defender chooses when contact occurs. The attacker remains exposed between contacts. Jamaica's interior acts as a filter that weakens organized force before it reaches its target. The colony's military problem is not courage or training. It is that the terrain does not suit the tools available. Supply defines the asymmetry of campaigns. Coastal garrisons can be fed by sea. Inland columns cannot. Roads are few, bridges unreliable, and pack animals scarce. Food must be carried or taken locally, and seizure increases hostility. Each mile inland increases dependence on a fragile chain of movement. British forces can win encounters and still lose campaigns because they cannot remain. Maroon forces can lose encounters and still preserve their system because they do not need to hold ground in the same way. Their aim is not continuous occupation but protection of food and people. Time favors the side whose supply comes from inside the territory rather than from outside it. Campaigns end when rations fail, sickness rises, or costs exceed perceived benefit. The imbalance lies in endurance, not weapons. Control of the interior requires persistence, and persistence requires a transport network that does not yet exist. Sugar production adds a timing constraint to this conflict. Harvest depends on continuous labor. Any disruption threatens profit directly. Planters therefore treat labor stability as a financial calculation. Loss of workers means loss of capital. Demography intensifies the pressure. Enslaved people form the majority, while armed whites are few. Militia lists look strong on paper, but prove unreliable in practice, especially when service leaves estates exposed. The colony's security problem is as much internal as external. Expeditions into the interior draw manpower away from fields and ports. Each campaign competes with production for the same limited pool of bodies. The result is a cycle in which repression increases weakness elsewhere. Security becomes a moving expense that cannot be fixed in one place. Jamaica's economy and its defense depend on the same labor supply, so strengthening one often weakens the other. Information failures intensify this cycle. Plantation managers cannot easily distinguish rumor from planning. Any sign of coordination is treated as conspiracy. The system leans toward repression because uncertainty is dangerous. Repression displaces people. Displacement increases the number of runaways. Larger Maroon settlements appear more threatening. Larger expeditions are approved. Costs rise. Each step follows internal logic, but the sequence magnifies the original problem. Attempts to restore control create the conditions that make control harder. The colony becomes trapped in a feedback loop. Fear produces force, force produces flight, and flight produces more fear. Lacking reliable intelligence, violence takes the place of knowledge. Punishment becomes a way of searching for threats. It is meant to deter, but it also reveals that the colony lacks other means of assessment. The system cannot see clearly into the interior, so it strikes at what it can reach. British methods adapt, but the constraint remains. Columns grow smaller. Trackers are employed. Dogs are used. Villages are burned when found. Patrols destroy gardens and intercept movement. These tactics increase the cost of Maroon life, but do not remove its basis. Disruption is not occupation. A destroyed provision ground can be replaced if the population survives. Patrols must return to base. The interior cannot be held without supply lines, and supply lines cannot be secured without roads. Attrition favors the side whose food system remains intact. Commanders change. Local knowledge does not. The British bring experience from other wars, but the Maroons accumulate experience in one place. Over time, campaigns reveal their limits. They can punish, but they cannot finish. The colony spends money to create movement without creating control. Military effort produces temporary dominance, not lasting rule. Maroon systems persist because they rest on three foundations: defensible terrain, a stable food base, and internal discipline. Provision grounds produce yams and plantains that do not require constant transport. Hunting and gathering supplement farming. Selective raiding supplies tools and weapons without dependence on large-scale plunder. Trade appears where it can be managed without exposure. These are acts of management, not disorder. Discipline enforces secrecy and regulates movement. Sentries control access. Punishments deter betrayal and desertion. Membership is screened. These are governing functions without formal bureaucracy. They allocate labor, manage risk, and preserve cohesion. Survival depends more on these routines than on any single fight. Violence is occasional. Organization is constant. The system endures because it reproduces itself daily through food and rule. Leadership within these communities is administration under pressure. It involves deciding how many people farm and how many watch the paths. It requires judging when to fight and when to withdraw. It balances raiding against negotiation and secrecy against growth. Compliance must be maintained without prisons or wages. Authority rests on the ability to distribute risk and reward. Leaders are not only fighters. They coordinate labor and control information. Their decisions determine whether a village remains hidden or becomes exposed, whether a raid strengthens the group or invites retaliation. Administration here is not paperwork. It is the daily alignment of survival tasks with environmental limits. Leadership is measured by continuity rather than conquest. Keeping people fed and together matters more than winning decisive encounters. The political aim is not to overthrow the colony, but to remain inside it without being absorbed. By the later stages of the conflict, the cost curve becomes clear. Extermination would require permanent occupation of terrain that cannot be cheaply supplied. The gains are uncertain because new runaways will continue to appear as long as plantations operate. Policy therefore shifts. Treaty becomes a budget decision. It replaces open-ended campaigns with defined obligations. Freedom is recognized within fixed boundaries. Land is assigned. Raiding is to end. Future runaways are to be returned. Maroon communities agree to assist in suppressing rebellions. A superintendent or liaison manages communication. Former enemies are turned into communities that police the edge of the plantation system. Autonomy becomes conditional and contractual. The colony does not gain the interior, it gains predictability. Violence is redirected rather than removed. The treaty is not a moral settlement, but an accounting one. It trades uncertainty for routine and turns a military problem into an administrative one. The contrast between leeward and windward communities shows how this arrangement takes different forms. In the West, closeness to plantations brings a steady flow of people and information. Contact is frequent. Conflict is constant but negotiable. Treaty stabilizes a relationship already shaped by exchange and pressure. Violence becomes regulated rather than continuous. In the East, isolation in the Blue Mountains produces longer resistance. Discipline is tighter. Authority is expressed through spiritual language that reinforces obedience and secrecy. Myth preserves lessons of survival and warns against betrayal. Governance here depends less on negotiation and more on cohesion. Both systems endure through different balances of contact and distance. One becomes a regulated border force. The other maintains separation longer by limiting exposure. Geography shapes political practice as much as military outcome. After treaty, the problem is redirected rather than solved. Maroons become enforcers of boundaries that protect plantations while preserving their own land. Payments and privileges tie them to colonial stability. Internal strain follows as new runaways must be turned away or returned. Plantation expansion presses against agreed borders. Incentives change as generations pass. The communities remain autonomous in form, but embedded in a wider system that defines their role. The treaty makes Jamaica governable by reducing the number of active fronts. It channels violence into controlled directions. It creates intermediaries who absorb pressure that would otherwise fall directly on the states. The interior shifts from constant war to managed difference. Stability is achieved not by eliminating alternatives, but by regulating them. The colony accepts limits to its reach in exchange for limits on disruption. The core mechanism in this history is supply. Sovereignty is not proclaimed, it is sustained. Control requires food and force to move together. Where they cannot, authority fragments. In Jamaica, terrain and population patterns prevent production and policing from merging inland. Maroon communities exploit that gap by building food systems independent of coastal networks. British responses disrupt those systems, but cannot replace them. Over time, disruption costs more than accommodation. The treaty is not a victory for either side. It is an equilibrium shaped by logistics. Violence changes direction rather than disappearing. The colony becomes governable, not because resistance is destroyed, but because it is bounded. Autonomy survives as a managed exception within a plantation economy that otherwise depends on continuous coercion. The Maroon Wars illustrate a wider pattern of empire in difficult terrain. Where administration moves ahead of infrastructure, alternative centers of control appear. Where labor is the main capital asset, instability becomes a financial risk. Where movement cannot be protected, force cannot be sustained. Jamaica's interior exposes these relationships with clarity. The wars are decided not only by fighting, but by the ability to feed people in specific places over time. The treaties emerge from calculation, not sentiment. They mark the point at which continued war yields diminishing returns. By turning opponents into boundary managers, the colony converts conflict into governance. The result is not peace, but a new form of order. Sovereignty follows supply.